He told me to make one call and lie about losing $20 million. I thought it was a strange legal strategy, until my own parents reacted in a way no loving family ever should. No panic, no questions, just relief. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, events, names, and situations are entirely imaginary and do not represent real people or actual incidents. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental. The moment my lawyer told me to call my parents and tell them I had lost $20 million, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. I sat there in his office, staring at him, waiting for him to correct himself or laugh and say it was some kind of joke. But he didn't smile. He didn't even shift in his seat. His expression stayed calm, serious, almost too controlled, like he had already thought through every possible reaction I might have. That made it even more unsettling. I had come to him expecting advice about protecting my assets after selling my company, not instructions to lie to the two people I trusted the most. I asked him why, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out strained. It didn't make sense to me. My parents had always been there for me. They had supported me when I had nothing, when my startup was just an idea scribbled in a notebook, when everyone else told me it wouldn't work. They celebrated every small win, every milestone. When the company finally took off and I sold it for a life-changing amount, they were the first people I called. I still remembered my mother crying with happiness, my father telling me how proud he was. Those memories didn't match what my lawyer was suggesting. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk, and said that sometimes the best way in people was to remove what they believed they could gain from you. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the way he said it made me uneasy. It sounded less like advice and more like a test I wasn't sure I wanted to take. I hesitated, my phone in my hand, feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. It felt wrong to lie, especially about something this serious. Losing $20 million wasn't a small thing. It was everything I had worked for. I tried to push back, telling him there had to be another way, but he remained firm. He said I had come to him because I wanted the truth about something that didn't feel right in my financial records, and this was the fastest way to get clarity. That caught my attention. There had been small irregularities, nothing obvious, nothing I could prove, but enough to make me uncomfortable. At the time, I had brushed them off as errors or misunderstandings. Now, sitting in that office, those small doubts started to feel bigger. Still, making that call felt like stepping into something I couldn't undo. I looked down at my phone again, my thumb hovering over my mother's name. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. For a moment, I almost refused. I almost stood up and walked out, telling him I wasn't going to play games with my family, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the quiet confidence in his voice, or maybe it was that small, growing doubt I couldn't ignore anymore. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button. It rang twice before my mother answered. Her voice sounded normal, warm, familiar. She asked how I was, if everything was okay, the usual questions she always asked. For a second, I nearly abandoned the plan. I almost told her everything was fine and hung up. But I forced myself to continue, my grip tightening around the phone as I spoke the words that didn't feel like mine. "Mom, I messed up?" I said, my voice lower than usual. "I lost all the money." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to feel different. I could hear faint background noise, maybe the television, maybe my father in the room, but she didn't speak immediately. When she finally did, her tone had changed, just slightly, but enough for me to note it. "How of it?" she asked. The question felt strange. I had expected shock, panic, maybe even disbelief. I had expected her to ask how it happened, if I was okay, if there was anything she could do. Instead, her question was direct, almost focused, as if she needed confirmation of a specific detail. "Yes," I said, forcing the word out. "Everything?" Another pause followed. This one felt heavier. I waited for her to react the way I thought she would, the way any parent would. I braced myself for concern, for urgency, for the kind of emotional response that matched the situation. But it didn't come. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost like a whisper. But there was something in it I couldn't quite place at first. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, something that didn't fit the moment at all. "Are you sure?" she asked. Before I could answer, I heard my father's voice in the background, asking what was going on. My mother repeated what I had said, and then there was a muffled exchange between them. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone. It didn't sound like panic. It sounded controlled, almost measured. That made my stomach tighten. I stood there in the office, my eyes fixed on nothing, every sense focused on the voices coming through the phone. My lawyer watched me silently, as if he was studying my reaction more than theirs. That made me even more aware that this wasn't just a random suggestion. He was waiting for something specific. My mother came back on the line, and this time her voice was steadier. Too steady. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't tell me everything would be fine. Instead, she said, "We'll talk about this later. Just, don't do anything else for now." The call ended shortly after that. No reassurance, no comfort, no urgency. Just a calm, almost detached response that didn't match the situation at all. I slowly lowered the phone, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt like I had missed something important, like there was a hidden meaning behind their reaction that I couldn't fully understand yet. I looked at my lawyer expecting him to explain, to tell me I was overthinking it, that everything was normal. But he didn't say that. Instead, he looked at me with the same calm expression and said that what I had just heard was exactly what he expected, and that the real answers would come next after the call ended. A strange silence filled the room, but it didn't feel calm or normal. It felt heavy, like something invisible had just shifted around me. I stood there for a moment, still holding my phone, replaying every second of the conversation in my head. The words themselves weren't what bothered me the most. It was how they were said. The tone, the pauses, the lack of emotion where there should have been plenty. It didn't match the parents I thought I knew. I finally looked at my lawyer, expecting him to explain what had just happened, or at least reassure me that I was reading too much into it. But he didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked almost certain, as if the reaction I had just witnessed confirmed something he already believed. That made my chest tighten. They didn't even ask how it happened. I said, my voice quieter now, as if saying it out loud made it more real. He nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off me. Exactly. That single word carried more weight than any long explanation could have. It wasn't just agreement, it was confirmation. I felt a flicker of defensiveness rise inside me. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe my parents were just shocked and didn't know how to react. People respond differently under stress, I told myself. Not everyone shows panic or emotion right away. You're reading too much into it. I said, trying to sound confident, even though I wasn't fully convinced myself. They were probably just surprised. But he didn't argue. Instead, he reached for a file on his desk and slid it toward me. The movement was slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to focus on what was inside before jumping to conclusions. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of what I was about to see. Inside were printed documents, logs, timestamps, technical details that I didn't immediately understand. At first glance, it looked like a collection of routine financial records. But as I looked closer, patterns began to appear. Repeated attempts to access my accounts, multiple login failures, locations and times that didn't match my own activity. What is this? I asked, my voice tightening. These are access logs from your financial accounts, he said calmly. Every attempt, successful or not, is recorded. I scanned the pages again, this time more carefully. The dates went back months, maybe longer. I tried to recall where I had been during some of those times, and quickly realized that many of those attempts couldn't have been me. I felt a slow, creeping discomfort as the realization began to form. Someone tried to get into my accounts? I asked. Not just once, he replied. Repeatedly. A chill ran through me. I had always been careful with my security. Strong passwords, two-factor authentication, private networks. I didn't share my financial details with anyone. At least, that's what I believed. The idea that someone had been trying to access my money without my knowledge made me feel exposed, like my entire life had been quietly watched from a distance. Did they get in? I asked quickly. He shook his head. No successful breaches. But the persistence is what matters. I leaned back slightly, trying to process it. My mind immediately jumped to possibilities: hackers, cybercriminals, random attacks. That would make sense. Someone targeting a large account, trying different ways to break in. It was unsettling, but at least it was logical. So it's just someone trying to hack me, I said, almost as a way to reassure myself. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he flipped a few pages in the file and pointed to a section highlighted in yellow. Look at the location data. I leaned forward again, focusing on the small details printed beside each attempt. IP addresses, approximate locations, timestamps. At first, it all looked technical and distant, like something happening somewhere far away. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The locations weren't random. They were familiar. Too familiar. These attempts, they're coming from the same area, I said slowly, my eyes narrowing as I read the NA regions and network identifiers. He nodded again, watching my reaction closely. Yes, I swallowed hard. That's near my parents' house. Saying it out loud felt wrong, like I was accusing them without meaning to. I shook my head almost immediately, trying to dismiss the thought before it could fully form. That doesn't mean anything. It could be anyone in that area. Neighbors, public networks, anything. It could be. He agreed calmly. But look at the timing. I followed his finger to another set of entries. The attempts weren't random in time either. They often happen late at night, early in the morning, or during hours when most people wouldn't be casually browsing or working. There was a pattern, a kind of consistency that didn't feel accidental. And now think about the call you just made, he added quietly. I froze. My mind immediately replayed my mother's voice, the way she asked, all of it? The lack of shock, the controlled tone, the absence of concern. Then my father's voice in the background, not panicked, not confused, but steady. Too steady. I felt a growing pressure in my chest as two separate things I had been trying to keep apart, started to connect. That's a coincidence, I said, but this time my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. he asked, his tone still calm but now sharper in meaning. I looked back down at the documents, but the words started to blur slightly. My thoughts were moving too fast, jumping from one memory to another. Small moments I had ignored before began to resurface. Questions my father had asked about my accounts. Times my mother had insisted on knowing more about my finances than seemed necessary. At the time, it had felt like concern, like curiosity, like family being involved in my life. Now, those same memories felt different. Uncomfortable. You're suggesting, I started but couldn't finish the sentence. I'm not suggesting anything yet, he said. I'm showing you patterns. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Part of me wanted to shut it all down, to reject the idea completely. It was easier to believe in random hackers than to even consider that someone close to me, someone I trusted, could be involved. But another part of me, quieter but persistent, couldn't ignore what I was seeing. The call, the reaction, the data. All of it was starting to align in a way that didn't feel accidental anymore. I looked up at him again, this time with a mix of confusion and unease. Why would anyone do this? I asked, though deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He held my gaze for a moment before responding, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten again. Because sometimes, he said slowly, the biggest risks don't come from strangers, they come from people who already know exactly what you have and how to reach it. That night, sleep felt impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything over and over again. The call with my parents, the documents my lawyer had shown me, the calm certainty in his voice. It all kept circling back in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. Every time I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, something else would surface, something small but unsettling, making that explanation harder to believe. I turned to my side, closing my eyes, hoping exhaustion would eventually take over, but instead my thoughts became even louder. Memories started coming back, not as clear events at first, but as fragments. Conversations I had dismissed, questions I hadn't thought twice about. At the time, they felt normal, just parents showing interest in their child's success. But now, in the quiet of the night, those same moments began to feel different. I remembered my father asking me about my passwords once, casually, as if it were no big deal. He had laughed it off, saying it was just in case of emergencies, in case something ever happened to me. I didn't think much of it back then. It sounded responsible, even caring. I had brushed it off with a joke, telling him everything was secure and there was no need to worry. But now, that memory lingered longer than it should have. Then there were the times my mother would insist that I share details about my finances. Not just general updates, but specifics. How much I had in certain accounts, where my money was invested, what kind of access systems I used. She always framed it as concern, saying she wanted to understand my life better. To be involved, I had taken it as a sign of love, of pride in what I had achieved. Now, those same questions felt intrusive. I sat up in bed, running a hand through my hair, trying to organize my thoughts. It didn't make sense. My parents had never given me a reason to doubt them before. They had always been there, always supportive. The idea that they could be connected to something like this felt impossible, almost absurd. And yet the evidence I had seen earlier refused to fade from my mind. The next morning came too quickly, and I hadn't slept at all. My head felt heavy, my thoughts slower but still restless. I went straight to my lawyer's office, needing answers, or at least something that could bring clarity to the confusion building inside me. When I arrived, he was already there, as if he had been expecting me. He didn't waste time with small talk. He simply nodded toward the chair and handed me another set of documents. This time, the file felt thicker, heavier, as if what it contained carried more weight than the last one. I hesitated before opening it, part of me unsure if I was ready to see more. Inside were more records, but these were different. They weren't just access logs. There were financial summaries, background checks, historical data that went back years, long before my company became successful. I flipped through the pages slowly, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice quieter now. Because you need context, he replied. I stopped at a section that had been marked clearly. It showed numbers, large numbers, but not in a positive way. Debts, outstanding balances, financial obligations that had accumulated over time. I frowned, reading more carefully, hoping I was misunderstanding. These are my parents' records. I asked, feeling a sudden tightness in my chest. He nodded. I kept reading, and with each line, the picture became clearer. Loans that hadn't been repaid, credit lines pushed beyond limits, investments that had failed. It wasn't just minor financial trouble, it was severe. The kind of debt that doesn't disappear easily, the kind that builds pressure over years. My hands felt slightly unsteady as I held the papers. I didn't know about any of this. I know, he said. That realization hit harder than anything else. Not just the existence of the debt, but the fact that they had hidden it from me. All those years, all those conversations, and not once had they mentioned the extent of their situation. I thought back to every time I had offered help, every time I had given them money without asking too many questions. They had accepted it, thanked me, but never revealed the full truth. Why wouldn't they tell me? I asked, more to myself than to him. There could be many reasons, he said. Pride, fear, or something else? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment, trying to process it. If they were in that much debt, it explained their interest in my success, their questions about my finances, but it still didn't fully explain the access attempts, the patterns, the reaction to my call. They saw you as a solution. My lawyer continued, his voice steady. I looked at him again, the words sinking in slowly. A solution, he nodded. You became financially successful very quickly. From their perspective, you were the fastest way out of a long-standing problem. I felt a mix of emotions rising, confusion, frustration, disbelief. I wanted to reject the idea, to argue against it, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that was hard to ignore. But I helped them, I said, my voice tightening slightly. I gave them money. I supported them. Wes, he said, but from what we can see, it wasn't enough to resolve everything. That word, everything, echoed in my mind. The scale of the debt I had just seen made it clear that whatever I had given them was only a small part of a much larger issue. I looked down at the papers again, the numbers now feeling less like abstract figures and more like a hidden reality I had been completely unaware of. A reality that might have been shaping their actions for years without me realizing it. So what are you saying? I asked slowly, though I was beginning to understand. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched me for a moment, as if measuring how much I was ready to accept. When he finally spoke, his words were calm but carried a weight that made it hard to look away. I'm saying that when people feel trapped, especially financially, they don't always make rational decisions, he said. And sometimes they justify actions they wouldn't normally consider. I swallowed hard, the implications settling in deeper now. The late-night access attempts, the detailed questions, the reaction to my supposed loss. It all started to form a pattern that was becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence. For the first time, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't push away, no matter how much I wanted to. What if this wasn't random at all? What if it had been building for years, quietly, carefully, right in front of me without me ever noticing? The more I sat with everything my lawyer had shown me, the harder it became to hold on to the version of reality I had always believed in. It wasn't just one piece of evidence anymore. It was a pattern, layered and consistent, stretching across years of my life. Still, there was a part of me that resisted fully accepting it. I needed something clearer, something undeniable, because what I was starting to suspect didn't just involve money. It involved trust, family, and everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. They saw you as their way out, my lawyer said, his voice steady, cutting through the silence that had settled between us. I shook my head almost immediately, instinctively pushing back against the idea. That doesn't make sense. I already helped them, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. I gave them money, a lot of it. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, acknowledging what I said, but there was something in his expression that told me he didn't see it the same way. You did, he replied, but based on what we've uncovered, it was enough to resolve their situation completely. That word again, enough. It lingered in my mind, uncomfortable and heavy. I thought back to every transfer I had made, every time I had stepped in without asking too many questions. At the time, it felt generous, responsible even. I believed I was helping them stabilize their lives, giving them relief from whatever struggles they had faced. But now, seeing the full extent of their financial situation, it felt like I had only been addressing the surface of something much deeper. They never told me how bad it was, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. That's often the case, he replied. People hide the full extent of their problems, especially from those they feel dependent on. The word shifted something in my thinking. It suggested not just need, but reliance. A kind of reliance that could turn into expectation, and eventually entitlement. I didn't want to believe that about my parents, but the idea had already started to take root. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, trying to organize the thoughts racing through my mind. Even if they were in trouble, that doesn't explain trying to access my accounts, I said. That's not asking for help. That's something else. Yes, my lawyer said calmly. It is. I looked up at him, waiting for him to elaborate, but he let the silence stretch for a moment, as if he wanted me to arrive at the conclusion myself. And slowly I did. They didn't just want help, I said, the realization forming as I spoke. They wanted control. He nodded once, confirming it without needing to say much more. The word control carried a different weight than anything we had discussed so far. Helping someone still leaves you in charge of your decisions. Control takes that away completely. It meant access, authority, the ability to move things without asking. It meant they wouldn't have to rely on my willingness anymore. They could simply act. A cold feeling settled in my chest as I considered what that implied. You think they were planning to take everything? I asked, my voice lower now. Not necessarily all at once, he replied, but based on the patterns we've observed, there's a strong indication they were trying to position themselves to gain full access over time. That could include transferring funds, changing ownership structures, or even making decisions on your behalf. The precision in his explanation made it harder to dismiss. This wasn't speculation thrown together loosely. It was structured, based on evidence and behavior. I could feel the last pieces of denial slipping away, replaced by something much heavier. "These are my parents," I said again, but this time it didn't sound like a defense. It sounded more like disbelief, like I was trying to remind myself of something that no longer felt as solid as it once did. "I understand," he said quietly, "and that's exactly why we need to be certain before taking any action." I exhaled slowly, realizing that despite everything we had uncovered, there was still one thing missing, proof that couldn't be questioned. Something direct, something that showed intent without interpretation. "So what do we do?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, his posture more relaxed, but his eyes remained focused. "We let them believe your situation has changed," he said. "You've already told them you lost the money. That changes their expectations. It forces them to reassess their position." I frowned, trying to follow his reasoning. And then we observe," he continued. "If their interest was purely based on your financial success, their behavior will shift now that they believe that success is gone. But if there's something more, if there was a plan already in motion, they won't stop. They'll adapt." The idea made sense, but it also made me uneasy. It meant waiting, watching, allowing things to unfold without interference. It meant giving them space to reveal something I wasn't sure I was ready to see. "They'll make their next move," he added. The certainty in his voice made it clear that he wasn't guessing. He expected something to happen, something that would either confirm or disprove everything we had been discussing. And based on everything so far, I had a feeling it would be the former. I stood up slowly, pacing the room as I tried to process it all. My thoughts kept shifting between past and present, between the parents I thought I knew and the possibility of who they might actually be. Every memory now felt uncertain, like it needed to be re-examined under a different light. "What if we're wrong?" I asked suddenly, stopping and turning toward him. "What if this is all just a misunderstanding?" "It's possible," he said, not dismissing the idea. "But that's exactly why we're not acting on assumptions. We're creating a situation where their intentions become clear on their own." I nodded slowly, understanding the logic, even if it didn't make the situation any easier to accept. This wasn't about accusing them. It was about revealing the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. "And if they do something?" I asked. "Then we'll have what we need," he replied. The simplicity of that answer contrasted sharply with the complexity of everything I was feeling. For him, it was a matter of evidence and outcome. For me, it was something far more personal, something that couldn't be measured in documents or logs. Still, there was no turning back now. The call had already been made. The first step had already set everything in motion. All that was left was to wait and see whether the people I trusted most would prove me wrong, or confirm the one possibility I had been trying so hard to avoid. 2 days passed, but it didn't feel like time was moving normally. Every hour stretched longer than it should have, filled with a constant tension I couldn't shake. I found myself checking my phone more often than usual, replaying the call in my mind, wondering if I had missed something important. My lawyer had told me to wait, to let things unfold naturally. But waiting turned out to be the hardest part. It wasn't just about what my parents might do. It was about what their actions would mean. When my phone finally rang, I felt it before I even saw it. A sudden tightening in my chest, a quiet instinct telling me this was it. I looked down at the screen and saw my father's name. For a moment, I just stared at it, my thumb hovering over the answer button. I wasn't ready, but I knew I couldn't avoid it either. His voice was calm, but it lacked the warmth I was used to. There was no casual greeting, no small talk. "We need to talk," he said. Direct and controlled. That alone felt different. My father was never someone who jumped straight into serious conversations without at least easing into them. The tone he used now felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Okay," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "When?" "Today," he said. "Come over?" The call ended shortly after that, with no further details, no attempt to explain what he wanted to discuss. It felt less like an invitation and more like a decision that had already been made for me. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone again, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. When I arrived at their house later that day, everything looked the same on the outside. The same walls, the same front door, the same quiet street I had known for years. But the familiarity didn't bring comfort this time. Instead, it made everything feel more unsettling, like something hidden beneath the surface was waiting to reveal itself. I knocked, and after a few seconds, the door opened. My mother stood there, but she didn't greet me the way she usually did. There was no smile, no immediate embrace. Her expression was tight, controlled, almost cautious. "Come in," she said quietly. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room instinctively. My father was already there, sitting down, his posture straight, his attention fixed on me. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the air itself carried tension. There were no distractions, no television, no background noise, just silence and expectation. I waited for one of them to speak first, but neither did. The lack of warmth, the absence of even basic concern, made it clear that this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. Finally, my father broke the silence. "If what you said is true," he began, his tone measured, Then we need to discuss what's left. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I didn't understand them, but because of what they didn't include. There was no, "Are you okay?" No, "What happened?" No sign of worry about me as a person. The focus was entirely on the money. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already had a sense of where this was going. My mother spoke next, her voice softer but just as controlled. "The accounts, the properties, anything that hasn't been affected. We need to understand the situation." I felt a tightening in my chest again, but this time it wasn't just confusion. It was something closer to realization. Every word they were saying aligned too perfectly with what my lawyer had warned me about. "Why do you need to understand it?" I asked carefully, watching their reactions closely. There was a brief pause, almost unnoticeable, but enough for me to catch. Then my father leaned forward slightly, his expression firm. "Because that money was never just yours," he said. The room seemed to go completely still. For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. The statement didn't just challenge my situation, it challenged everything. My work, my success, the years I had spent building something from nothing. The idea that it wasn't entirely mine felt like a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be easily undone. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign that he didn't fully mean what he had said, but there was none. He wasn't angry, he wasn't emotional, he was certain. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice lower now. "It means we've been part of this from the beginning," he replied. "Everything you've achieved didn't happen in isolation." My mother nodded slightly, adding to his point without interrupting. "We supported you. We sacrificed for you. It's not unreasonable to expect some level of control or involvement." Control. The word echoed in my mind again, this time coming directly from them, not from my lawyer's analysis. It didn't feel like a misunderstanding anymore. It felt like confirmation. I kept my expression neutral, even though my thoughts were racing. Every piece of evidence, every warning, every doubt I had tried to ignore was now lining right in front of me. And the most unsettling part was how natural they made it sound, as if their perspective was completely justified. "So you want access," I said, not as a question but as a statement. My father didn't hesitate. "We need it," he corrected. There was no denial, no attempt to soften the request. It was direct, clear, and intentional. The kind of clarity that only comes when someone has already made up their mind. I glanced at my mother, hoping to see something different, some hesitation or discomfort, but she avoided my gaze for a moment before speaking again. "This isn't about taking anything from you," she said. "It's about managing what's left properly." The wording felt careful, but the meaning was obvious. They weren't asking for permission in the way I had always understood it. They were positioning themselves as necessary, as if their involvement wasn't optional but required. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch for a moment as I absorbed everything. The situation had moved beyond suspicion now. It was no longer about interpreting behavior or analyzing patterns. It was happening, right in front of me, in a way that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel confused. I felt clear, and that clarity came with a realization that settled deeply and firmly in my mind. They weren't hiding it anymore. For a brief moment after my father's words settled into the silence, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. It wasn't relief or acceptance. It was clarity. Everything that had felt uncertain before now stood in front of me without disguise. There was no need to interpret tone or analyze behavior anymore. They had said it themselves. They wanted access, not out of concern, not out of support, but out of belief that they were entitled to it. I kept my expression steady, even though my thoughts were moving quickly beneath the surface. This was the moment my lawyer had prepared me for, the point where speculation turned into something concrete. I had to be careful now. One wrong reaction, one emotional outburst, and everything we had planned could fall apart. "So you've been trying to access my accounts?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and controlled. The question hung in the air longer than expected. Neither of them answered immediately, but their reaction said enough. My father's posture stiffened slightly, and my mother's eyes shifted away for just a second. It was subtle, but it was there. A pause that shouldn't have existed if the answer was a simple no. Then my father exhaled slowly, as if deciding there was no point in denying anymore. "We did what we had to do," he said. There was no apology in his voice, no hesitation, just justification. That alone felt more unsettling than anything else he could have said. It meant he didn't see it as wrong. He saw it as necessary. My mother spoke next, her tone softer, but her words carried the same meaning. "You don't understand what we've been through," she said. For a second, I almost reacted emotionally. There was a part of me that wanted to argue, to remind them that I had tried to help, that I had been there whenever they needed me, but I stopped myself. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about letting them reveal the full extent of their thinking. I nodded slightly, as if considering her words. "Actually," I said quietly, "I think I do." That seemed to catch them off guard. My father frowned slightly, as if trying to read my reaction more carefully now. The dynamic in the room shifted just a little. They were no longer completely in control of the conversation. I stood up slowly, not in anger, but with purpose. My movements were deliberate, measured. I could feel their attention follow me, their expressions tightening as they tried to understand what I was about to do next. That's when the door behind me opened. The sound was enough to break the tension in the room. My parents turned instinctively, their focus shifting away from me for the first time since I arrived. My lawyer stepped inside, his presence calm but authoritative, followed by 2 investigators who carried themselves with quiet professionalism. The change in my parents' expressions was immediate. Confusion first, then realization, then fear. My mother's face lost its color, her composure slipping as she looked from me to the people entering the room. My father remained still, but the firmness in his posture was gone. For the first time, he didn't look certain. "What is this?" he asked, his voice no longer as controlled as before. My lawyer didn't rush his response. He walked in slowly, closing the door behind him, giving the moment time to settle. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost neutral, but every word was precise. "All conversations in this meeting have been recorded," he said, "and we have documented evidence of repeated unauthorized attempts to access financial accounts." The words landed with a finality that couldn't be ignored. There was no room for interpretation, no space to argue based on emotion or perspective. It was factual, structured, and supported. My mother took a step back, her hand rising slightly as if she needed something to steady herself. This isn't necessary," she said, her voice breaking. But it was too late for that. My father didn't speak right away. His eyes moved between me and my lawyer, calculating, searching for a way to regain control of the situation. But the confidence he had earlier was gone. In its place was something else, something closer to realization that the situation had moved beyond his influence. "You set this up," he said finally, looking directly at me. I met his gaze without hesitation. "No," I replied. "You did." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. There were no more arguments, no more justifications. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, and now it existed as evidence, not just words. One of the investigators stepped forward slightly, placing a folder on the table. It contained copies of the records my lawyer had shown me, along with additional documentation. Timelines, digital traces, confirmations that connected everything together. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a complete picture. My mother began to cry quietly, the controlled composure she had maintained earlier completely gone. But even that didn't change the reality of what had happened. It didn't erase the attempts, the planning, or the intent behind it all. My father remained silent, his expression harder to read now. There was no anger, no visible regret, just a quiet acceptance that the situation had turned against him. For the first time in my life, I looked at both of them and didn't feel the same connection I always had. It wasn't replaced by hatred or even anger. It was something colder, something more distant. A realization that the people standing in front of me were not who I thought they were. Everything that had been hidden was now exposed. Every doubt I had pushed aside was now confirmed. And the truth, once fully revealed, left no space for denial, no room for misunderstanding, and no way to return to what things used to be in the weeks that followed. Everything moved forward with a kind of quiet efficiency that felt almost unreal compared to the emotional weight of what had happened. There were no dramatic confrontations, no drawn-out arguments, and no public scenes. Instead, the situation was handled through structured meetings, legal processes, and carefully documented agreements. It felt distant, almost clinical, as if something deeply personal had been reduced to a series of formal steps and signatures. The evidence had made things simple from a legal standpoint. The access attempts, the recorded conversation, the patterns over time, everything pointed clearly in one direction. There was no room left to deny or reinterpret what had been done. Because of that, the process didn't drag on. It moved steadily toward resolution. Each step bringing a kind of closure that didn't feel satisfying, only necessary. I attended the meetings because I had to, but I spoke very little. Most of the discussions were handled by my lawyer, who remained calm and precise, focusing only on the facts. My parents were there too, but the dynamic between us had completely changed. The familiarity that once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by a distance that felt impossible to bridge. They didn't try to argue much. At first, there were small attempts to explain their actions, to frame them as misunderstandings or desperate decisions made under pressure. But those explanations didn't hold up against the evidence. Eventually, even those attempts faded, replaced by quiet compliance. They signed the documents. Confessions acknowledging the unauthorized access attempts. Agreements restricting any future involvement in my financial matters. Legal boundaries that ensured they could no longer approach my accounts, my assets, or anything connected to them. Each signature felt final, not just in a legal sense, but in a personal one. It marked the end of something that had existed my entire life. Not just trust, but the idea of who they were to me. At one point, my lawyer asked me privately whether I wanted to pursue further action. The option was there. Given the evidence, there could have been more serious consequences. Legal penalties that went beyond restrictions and agreements. I understood what that would mean, and I thought about it carefully. But in the end, I chose not to. It wasn't because I believed they deserved leniency. It wasn't even because I felt forgiveness in that moment. The truth was more complicated. Pursuing harsher consequences wouldn't have given me anything back. It wouldn't restore the trust that had been broken or erase what I had learned about them. It would only extend the situation, keep it alive longer than necessary. I had already lost something far more important than money. I had lost the version of my parents I thought I knew. After everything was finalized, the meetings stopped, the calls stopped, the connection that once felt constant simply ended, not with a clear decision, but with an understanding that there was nothing left to say. It wasn't a dramatic separation. It was quiet, almost empty, as if the relationship had already faded before the final moment arrived. A few days later, I met my lawyer one last time to review everything. The process was complete. My accounts were secure, my assets protected, and the legal safeguards were in place to prevent anything like this from happening again. From an external perspective, it looked like a success. A problem identified, managed, and resolved. But sitting there, it didn't feel like a victory. He closed the file in front of him and looked at me, his expression softer than usual. "I need to tell you something," he said. I waited, sensing that this wasn't just another procedural detail. "I had strong suspicions from the beginning," he continued. "The access patterns, the locations, the timing, it all pointed somewhere close to you. But I needed confirmation before taking any action." I nodded slowly, understanding now why everything had been handled the way it was. "That's why you told me to call them," I said. "Yes," he replied. "When people believe there's nothing left to gain, their behavior changes. It removes the incentive to pretend." I thought back to that moment. The call, the silence, the tone in my mother's voice. At the time, it had only felt strange. Now, it felt like the first clear sign of everything that followed. "They showed you who they were," he added quietly. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, letting the weight of that statement settle in. It wasn't said with judgment or emotion, just as a simple fact. And that's what made it harder to ignore. Eventually, I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. There was nothing more to discuss, no loose ends left to tie up. Everything that needed to be done had already been completed. As I walked out of the office, I realized that despite everything, my life was still intact in a practical sense. My finances were secure. My future was still under my control. On paper, I hadn't lost anything, but internally, it felt different. There was a shift in how I saw things, how I understood trust, how I viewed the people around me. The experience had stripped away a layer of certainty I didn't even realize I relied on. It replaced it with something more cautious, more aware. I had spent years building something valuable, something that gave me independence and security. And in the end, that same success had revealed a truth I might never have seen otherwise. The hardest part wasn't what they tried to take. It was what I discovered along the way, that sometimes the people you believe are closest to you can see your success not as something to celebrate, but as something to claim. And that understanding changes the way you look at everything, including the meaning of trust, loyalty, and what it truly means to protect not just your assets, but yourself. What started as a simple call turned into a revelation I never expected. In the end, it wasn't just about money. It was about trust, family, and discovering who people really are when the stakes are highest. The lessons I learned were harsh, but they reshaped how I see relationships, loyalty, and the importance of protecting not just what you own, but who you let into your life. If this story shocked you, inspired you, or made you question the people around you, make sure to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to cry for more true to life stories that reveal the unexpected twists hiding behind ordinary lives. Remember, the truth often comes in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes, the people closest to you aren't who you think they are.